Collectively, they came to be known as the Pennsylvania Dutch from Deutsch. There were few German Catholics in Pennsylvania before the 1810s. The Studebaker brothers, forefathers of the wagon and automobile makers, arrived in Pennsylvania in 1736 from the famous blade town of Solingen, where with their skills, they made wagons that carried the frontiersmen westward. Their cannons provided the Union Army with artillery in the American Civil War, and their automobile company became one of the largest in America, although never eclipsing the Big Three, and was a factor in the war effort and the industrial foundations of the army. When the American Revolution broke out, Britain made arrangements for the German princes to hire some 30,000 Hessian soldiers to fight for the American army. The largest group came from the country of Hesse, and soldiers there are often referred to as Hessians. Many prisoners of the American farms, some of whom permanently settled in America. Many became prisoners of the American farms, some of whom permanently settled in America. From names in the 1790s US Census, historians estimate that Germans constituted nearly 9% of the white population of the United States. German population density in the United States in 1872. The Warrenberger House in Austin, which served as a German-American school in the 19th century. From the Old to the New World shows German immigrants boarding a steamliner in Hamburg to New York. Harper's Weekly, November 7th, 1874. The largest flow of German immigration to America occurred between 1820 and World War I, during which nearly 6 million Germans immigrated to the United States. From 1840 to 1880, there were the largest groups of immigrants. Following the revolutions of 1848 in the German states, a wave of political refugees fled to America, who became known as the 48ers. They included professionals, journalists and politicians. Prominent 48ers include Carl Schurz and Henry Villard. The cities of Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, New York and Baltimore were favoured destinations of German immigrants. By 1900, the populations of the city of Cleveland, Milwaukee, Hoboken and Cincinnati were all more than 40% German American. Topeka and Davenport, Iowa, had even larger populations, as did Omaha, Nebraska, where the proportion of German ancestry was 57% in 1910. In other northern cities such as Fort Wayne, Indiana, German Americans were at least 30% of the population. Many concentrations acquired distinctive names suggesting their heritage, such as Over the Rhine District in Cincinnati and German Village in Columbus, Ohio. A favourite destination was Milwaukee, known as the German Athens. Radical Germans trained in politics in the Old Country dominated the city's socialists. Skilled workers dominated many crafts, while entrepreneurs created the brewing industry. The most famous brands included Pabst, Schultz, Miller and Blast. Whereas half of the German immigrants settled in cities, the other half established farms in the Midwest. From Ohio to the Plains states, a heavy presence persists in rural areas into the 21st century. Few Germans settled in the Deep South, apart from some in New Orleans. Texas attracted many Germans who entered through Galveston, both those who came to farm and later immigrants who more rapidly took industrial jobs in the cities such as Houston. As in Milwaukee, Germans in Houston built the brewing industry. By the 1920s, the first generation of college-educated German Americans were moving into the chemical and oil industries. Texas had about 200,000 German Americans in the 1850s. They did not form a uniform bloc, but who were highly diverse and drew from geographic areas and all sectors of European society, except that very few aristocrats or upper middle class businessmen arrived. In this regard, Texas Germania was a microcosm of Germania nationwide. The Germans who settled in Texas were diverse in many ways. They included peasant farmers, intellectuals, Protestants, Catholics, Jews and atheists, Prussians, Saxons, Hessians, abolitionists and slave owners, farmers and townsfolk, frugal, honest folk and axe murderers. They differed in dialect, custom and physical features. A majority had been farmers in Germany and many arrived seeking economic opportunities. A few dissident intellectuals fleeing from the 1848 revolution sought political freedom, but few, say perhaps the Wends, went for religious freedom. German settlement in Texas reflected their diversity. Even in the confined areas of the hill country such as the valley offered a different kind of German. The Lallo Valley had stern, teetotal German Methodists who renounced dancing and fraternal organisations. The Perdinells Valley had fun-loving, hard-working Lutherans and Catholics who enjoyed drinking and dancing, and the Guadalupe Valley had atheist Germans descended from intellectual political refugees. The scattered German ethnic islands were also largely Westphalian Catholic, Waker Ochteree country, Midwestern Mennonite, Humville in Clay Country, Russian German Baptists and Lockett in Wibber County, Wendish Lutherans. Now, temporary quarters for the Volga Germans in central Kansas in 1875. Germans from Russia were the most traditional of the German-speaking arrivals. They were Germans who had lived for generations throughout the Russian Empire, but especially along the Volga River in Russia, near the Crimea in the current Ukraine. Of course, Ron Paul comes from the German-Ukrainian stock. Their ancestry had come from all over the German-speaking world. Invited by Catherine the Great in 1762 and 1763 to settle and introduce more advanced German agricultural methods to rural Russia. They had been promised by the manifesto of their settlement the ability to practice their respective Christian denominations, retain their culture and language, and retain the immunity from conscription for them and their descendants. As time passed, the German monarchy gradually eroded the ethnic German population's relative autonomy. Conscription eventually was reinstated. This was especially harmful to the Mennonites who practiced pacifism. Throughout the 19th century, pressure increased from the Russian government to culturally assimilate. Many Germans from Russia found it necessary to emigrate to avoid conscription and to preserve their culture. About 100,000 emigrated in 1900, settling primarily in the Dakotas, Kansas and Nebraska. The south-central part of North Dakota was known as the German-Russian Triangle. A smaller number moved further west, finding employment as ranchers and cowboys. Negatively influenced by the violation of their rights and cultural persecution by the Tsar, the Germans from Russia who settled in the North Midwest saw themselves as a downtrodden ethnic group, separated from the Russian Americans and having an entirely different experience from the German Americans who had immigrated from the German lands. They settled in tight-knit communities that retained their German language and culture. They raised large families, built German-style churches, buried their dead in distinctive cemeteries using cast-iron grave markers, and created choir groups that sang German church hymns. Many farmers specialised in sugar beets, still a major crop in the upper Great Plains. During World War I, their identity was challenged